most famous psychopath in television history was never actually a psychopath? What if every awkward interaction, every rehearsed smile, every moment Dexter Morgan spent studying humans like they were a different species wasn't the mask of a killer, but the way someone copes when they were given the wrong label at 7 years old, and nobody ever bothered to look twice? In this video, we're putting Dexter Morgan on a diagnostic table. We're checking him against Robert Hare's Psychopathy Checklist Revised, holding his behaviors up to the next DSM-5 criteria for autism spectrum disorder, pulling specific scenes from both the Showtime series and Jeff Lindsay's novels, and looking at real published clinical research to answer a question the show never fully settled. We'll walk through the evidence piece by piece, and by the end, you know exactly what Dexter Morgan is and what he isn't. Dexter Morgan was called a psychopath inside the world of the show, and Jeff Lindsay wrote him as one in the novels. But that label came from a homicide detective and a brain doctor who both needed it to be true. The psychopath label starts with Harry Morgan. When 7-year-old Dexter got caught killing neighborhood animals, Harry, a cop, not a doctor, decided his adopted son was a psychopath who was born needing to kill. That one call changed everything. Harry brought in Dr. Evelyn Vogel, a brain specialist who focused on psychopaths, and two of them built the code of Harry around one core belief: Dexter's violence couldn't be stopped, only aimed in a less harmful direction. In Season 8, Episode 1, A Beautiful Day, Vogel tells Dexter she thinks psychopaths are alpha wolves who help the human race survive long enough to become civilized. All season long, she calls him perfect as a psychopath, keeps saying people like you, and was writing a journal about him, labeling him Subject Zero for a book she wanted to publish. In Lindsay's 2004 novel, Darkly Dreaming Dexter, the character talks through first-person narration like someone completely cut off from the rest of humanity. He talks about regular people like they're a totally different species. The book version of Dexter is colder than the show version. When he gets a tiny flash of feeling, his reaction is basically shock that he's even able to feel anything. Harry in the books also pegged Dexter as a violent psychopath and built the code around that idea. Robert Hare's Psychopathy Checklist Revised is the go-to tool doctors use to measure psychopathy. It has 20 items, each scored 0, 1, or 2, adding up to a max of 40. A score of 30 or higher usually means psychopath. Factor 1 looks at personality traits: fake charm, being manipulative, flat emotion, no guilt or empathy. Factor 2 looks at behavior: acting without thinking, being careless, getting in trouble young, getting bored easily. A study in the Ilmu Buddha Journal ran Dexter through the PCLR using Hare's system along with Hervey Klecky's mask obscenity framework. They found Dexter matched 19 of 20 traits across both factors. The only one he missed was breaking out of prison or violating parole, because he was never caught. 19 out of 20. Sounds like case closed. Except the PCLR was built by Hare in the 1980s for use with actual prisoners and needs to be given by a trained mental health professional through a proper sit-down interview backed up by outside records. Scoring a made-up character just by watching what he does on screen skips all the depth the text actually requires. Even bigger problem, that study took Dexter's outer behavior at face value. Look at his charm. In the first novel, Dexter straight up tells us he's learned how to be charming like someone learning a card trick, that anyone can fake it if they don't mind saying all the obvious, stomach-turning things people want to hear. That's not smooth, natural charm that Hare Factor 1 is talking about. That's a guy who built himself a social instruction manual because talking to people didn't make sense to him on its own. There's a huge difference between someone who reads people like a book and uses it against them versus someone who had to memorize a script because he couldn't figure out basic conversation. The psychopath label got slapped on by a detective making a gut call about a 7-year-old and backed up by a researcher who needed Dexter to prove her whole career right. The checklist match looks solid until you actually watch how Dexter handles the social world across 8 seasons and 8 novels. Before we continue, if you're finding this breakdown interesting, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because the psychopath checklist says one thing, Dexter's real behavior says something totally different. And that takes us to the traits that don't just poke holes in the psychopath diagnosis, they blow it wide open. Some of Dexter Morgan's most core behaviors go directly against what psychopathy looks like while lining up perfectly with the official criteria for autism spectrum disorder. The DSM-5 spells out autism spectrum disorder through 2 main areas. Area A is lasting problems with social communication and interaction in different settings, trouble with back and forth social exchange, problems reading body language and facial expressions, and difficulty building and keeping relationships. Area B is narrow, repeated patterns of behavior, interest or activities, sticking hard to routines, intense focus on specific topics, and doing things in the same ritualized way over and over. Now, look at Dexter through that frame. His social struggles are everywhere in the series. In season 1, he doesn't get why people make small talk. He brings donuts to Miami Metro not because he likes hanging out with coworkers, but because he figured out that bringing donuts is a trick that makes people think you're friendly. His inner voice in both the show and the books describes watching human behavior the way a scientist watches animals in the wild. He practices making the right face. He keeps a mental list of correct emotional reactions and pulls from it like a cheat sheet. Then look at his relationship with Rita Bennett. Dexter picked Rita on purpose because she was an abuse survivor who wasn't looking for anything physical at the time. He says in both the show and the first novel that he has no interest in sex, and this is shown as just part of who he is, not some trick he's playing. The PCLR actually lists sleeping around as a psychopath trait under Factor 2. Dexter isn't just missing that trait, he's the complete opposite. He finds the whole thing draining and confusing. The Wikipedia talk page for his character catches this perfectly. He chose his girlfriend specifically because she didn't want sex either. His repeated rigid behaviors are just as telling. His kill ritual never changes. Same prep steps, same plastic wrap, same tools in the same spots, same talk with the victim, same blood slide taken from the right cheek, same box to store it in. This goes way past just being careful as a criminal. It looks a lot of what the DSM-5 calls ritualized patterns, doing things the same exact way because the routine itself matters to him psychologically. His whole career spent on blood spatter analysis, one super specific field practiced for decades. Looks like the kind of deep, narrow interest that shows up all over the autism spectrum. Lisa Firestone, a psychologist who wrote about Dexter in the Smart Pop book, The Psychology of Dexter, made a really important point. She said that while Dexter does show some psychopath-like traits, he also shows awkwardness in close relationships and a missing sex drive that doesn't match how real psychopaths act in their personal lives at all. She pointed to research from psychologist David Farrington showing that calling a kid a psychopath is risky because normal growing up behaviors, even animal cruelty, can look like permanent psychopath traits when they're just really a phase or a reaction to something else. Here's the thing that every quick take on Dexter gets wrong. Psychopaths are good with people. That's literally the whole point of Hare's Factor 1. A psychopath reads a room without trying, gets how social situations work on instinct, and uses all of that as a weapon. They don't stumble through conversations, they run them. Dexter is awful at social stuff, consistently, painfully awful. He can't read a room to save his life. When Rita got mad that he didn't act jealous after their neighbor Elliot kissed her in season 4, Dexter had to find out afterward that jealousy was what was supposed to show. A psychopath would have faked the right emotion on the spot without even thinking about it. Dexter didn't even know the right emotion existed until somebody told him. What Dexter actually does, watching how people act, writing mental scripts, practicing expressions, using memorized responses, is what autism experts call masking. It's when someone consciously builds a normal-looking version of themselves to get through a social world that doesn't make natural sense to them. Dexter's whole life is masking. He tells us that himself over and over in both the show and the books. The trait that made everyone buy the psychopath label, no visible emotions, social problems, strict routines, tunnel vision focus, fit the autism spectrum just as well. The traits that should knock out the psychopath's diagnosis, real social confusion, zero sex drive, charm that takes effort instead of coming naturally, got ignored because everybody in Dexter's world had already bought into a label that a cop put on a scared kid. Recognizing the autistic traits doesn't wrap this up though, because Dexter's emotional journey across 8 seasons tells us something no checklist ever could, and that journey is where the psychopath theory completely breaks down. Dexter Morgan's proven ability to grow emotionally across the series doesn't fit with psychopathy at all, but it fits perfectly with how people on the autism spectrum slowly learn to understand and show their feelings over time. Under Hare's PCLR model, the emotional problems that define psychopathy, flat feelings, no empathy, can't form real bonds, are built-in, permanent parts of someone's personality. They don't get better with time or treatment. Now look at what actually happens in the show. Season 1, Episode 10, Seeing Red. Rita's abusive ex-husband Paul threatens her. Dexter, without planning it, smacks Paul with a frying pan. This wasn't thought out, it was pure reflex. Firestone called out this exact moment in her published analysis as proof that Dexter was showing protective care that he swears up and down he can't feel. The guy who says he's empty inside acted on gut instinct to protect someone he supposedly doesn't care about. Season 3, Episode 12. Dexter is tied down on the Skinner's table. While talking to his vision of Harry about Rita being pregnant, Harry starts crying. Harry tells him those tears aren't his, they're Dexter's. Dexter says he never felt anything like this before and that he wants to live so he can see his son be born. The show treats this as a real turning point. Season 4 beyond, after Harrison is born, the show flat out tells us that Dexter's human side stopped being just an act. He feeds Harrison bottles, watches over him, plays with him. He went from faking every single emotion to actually caring about his family. Season 5, Episode 1, My Bad. At Rita's funeral after the Trinity Killer murdered her, Dexter says she has a big enough heart for both of them, that he wasn't even human when they first met. His vision of Harry later tells him that killing a man in a blind rage over Rita's death was the first truly human thing he's ever seen Dexter do. Season 8, Vogel tells Dexter his worry about Deborah doesn't fit with being a psychopath. She compares it to Michelangelo trying to play the banjo. The show keeps proving her wrong. Dexter keeps having emotional reactions that catch even the expert off guard. In one scene, Vogel looks at him closely and admits she can tell he really does feel bad about what happened to Deborah. Then she adds, clearly confused, it's just so unusual. By Dexter Resurrection in 2025, the character openly shows how scared he is of Harrison pushing him away. He saves strangers because he wants to help them. He tells Harrison that he's all he has, and the show shows this as real pain, not acting. This kind of growth cannot happen under the medical definition of psychopathy. You don't just start feeling empathy at 35 after going your whole adult life without it. The emotional gaps in Harris Factor 1 aren't things that you've gotten around to learning yet. They come from how the brain itself handles emotions at a basic wiring level, especially the amygdala, which Vogel herself brings up in Season 8 when talking about how psychopath brains work. What can happen is slowly learning to spot and express emotions that were always there, but locked away or unrecognizable. Research shows that alexithymia, which basically means having a hard time figuring out and putting words to your own feelings, shows up in about half of autistic people. People with alexithymia don't lack emotions, they lack the ability to tell what they're feeling. When Dexter keeps saying he feels nothing, that might not mean that his emotions are missing. It might mean he genuinely can't tell what's going on inside him. The show actually gives us a clear reason for this. Dexter saw his mother get murdered when he was just 3 years old and sat in her blood for 2 days. Harry's instant reaction was to stamp the word psychopath on young Dexter, handing the kid a ready-made identity that shut the door on ever exploring what he actually felt. If Dexter was a traumatized autistic child with alexithymia, Harry's label would have worked like a trap. He was told he couldn't feel, so he stopped trying to figure out if he could. He was told he was a monster, so he built his whole life around being one. Now, drop a comment below. Did Harry's psychopath label actually create the monster? Would real therapy have changed everything? I want to hear what you think. Dexter's emotional growth from Season 1 through Resurrection follows the path of a traumatized person slowly getting access to feelings that were always there but buried, not a psychopath suddenly developing empathy that his brain was never designed to produce. We've shown that the psychopath label is shaky, and that the autism angle explains things that psychopathy can't, but we haven't tackled the biggest problem yet, because there's one thing autistic people almost never are, and that's violent. Dexter killing doesn't belong to psychopathy or autism as a diagnosis. It belongs to what happened to him as a child. Autism spectrum disorder has no medical link to hunting people down and hurting them. Study after study shows autistic people are way more likely to be hurt by others than to hurt anyone themselves. Autism does not explain why Dexter kills. Psychopathy doesn't automatically make someone a killer either. Vogel says this herself in Season 8. Psychopath traits show up in top CEOs and powerful politicians. Hare has written plenty about psychopaths who never break a single law and do just fine in business. The FBI's 2008 report, Serial Murder, Multidisciplinary Perspective for Investigators, points to childhood trauma as a major factor in what turns someone into a serial killer. Dexter watched his mother, Laura Moser, get cut apart with a chainsaw inside a shipping container when he was 3, then sat in a pool of her blood for about 2 days. His biological brother Brian, who saw the same thing, also grew up to be a serial killer, the ice truck killer in Season 1. In Lindsay's novels, Dexter's stepkids, Aster and Cody, started showing violent tendencies after being abused by their biological father, Paul Bennett. Lindsay treats violence as something that comes from trauma across the whole book series, not as a built-in feature of any particular condition. The PCLR doesn't list kills people as a trait. The DSM-5 doesn't list it either. Violence is something someone does, not something someone is. The real question isn't which label caused the killing, it's which profile explains everything else about how Dexter works when you take the trauma out of the picture. A traumatized kid who's a psychopath would be smooth with people from the jump, naturally manipulative, sexually active early, and emotional flat in a way that never changes. A traumatized kid on the autism spectrum with alexithymia would be confused by social situations, build fake social masks, get stuck on specific interests, follow rigid routines, struggle to name their own emotions for years before slowly getting better at it, and form real bonds that shock everyone around them, including themselves. Dexter matched the second description across the full run of the series. The killing came from the trauma, the way Dexter moves through the rest of his life, the social confusion, the masking, the routines, the slow emotional awakening came from something Harry never even thought about because he already made up in his mind about what his son was before anyone with real medical training ever got involved. Across both Jeff Lindsay's novels and the Showtime television series, all the evidence put together points to Dexter Morgan as someone on the autism spectrum who also has alexithymia and severe PTSD, whose violence came from extreme childhood trauma that got managed through a code instead of treated by actual doctors. The novel shows a character who runs his whole life through rigid systems, describes normal human interaction like it's an alien language, pours all his focus into one specific work skill, has no interest in sex, and slowly discovers emotional depth he never knew he had. In Dexter in the Dark, the third novel, when the dark passenger temporarily leaves him, Dexter feels sadness and anger as emotions that were held down, not emotions that were never there. The show gives us an 8-season emotional journey from total shutdown to real love, grief, fear, and openness. He protects Rita on impulse in season 1. He reaches fatherly emotion through Harry in season 3. He genuinely mourns Rita in season 5. He fights to help Deborah against Vogel's professional opinion in season 8. He's afraid of his own son rejecting him in Resurrection. Vogel, the show's in-house expert, keeps getting caught off guard by how much Dexter actually feels. She tells him he's not the perfect psychopath she thought he was. The show frames this as Vogel getting it wrong about Dexter, not Dexter getting it wrong about psychopathy. Dexter Morgan sits in a space that medical textbooks haven't fully figured out yet. He has real psychopath-like features, killing animals as a kid, the urge to murder, cold and calculated violence. He has real autism-like features, not getting social cues, learned masking, locked-in routines, deep neural interest, no sex drive, alexithymia, and he has heavy trauma responses, shutting down emotionally, the dark passenger as a way to push his urges outside of himself, decades of buried feelings. The most honest clinical take would probably be something like complete developmental trauma mixed with traits of both antisocial personality disorder and autism spectrum disorder, made way worse by the fact that nobody ever gave him the right kind of help when it could have made a difference. Harry wasn't a doctor. He was a cop who saw a dangerous kid and built a system around guesses he never second-guessed. Vogel wasn't looking at Dexter with fresh eyes. She was a researcher who needed Dexter to be a psychopath so her whole career meant something. Neither of them ever stopped to consider that the awkward, socially lost, routine-obsessed, emotionally confused boy sitting in front of them might have been something completely different from what they decided he was the day they met him. Dexter Morgan got called a psychopath by people who needed him to be one. The evidence across the novels, 8th season, New Blood, and Resurrection paints a different picture. A picture of a traumatized, likely neurodivergent person whose real emotional depth got buried under decades of a label that was never properly tested. He was never the empty monster Harry was afraid of. He was someone who never got the chance to figure out what he actually was. From the 7-year-old killing animals in the backyard to the grown man terrified of losing his son in Resurrection, Dexter Morgan's story isn't really a study in psychopathy. It's a study in what happens when the wrong label meets the wrong solution at the worst possible time. And nobody stops to ask whether the word they stamped on a traumatized child might have been the very thing that turned him into a killer. If this breakdown changed how you see Dexter Morgan, subscribe and turn on notifications so you can catch our next deep dive. And check out our previous video breaking down exactly how long it would take for Dexter to clear the FBI's most wanted list.